In this lecture, we're going to make some fun little houses using edit mode to edit our shapes, ready for a fun landscape later on. Okay, so I want to start with a challenge. I want you to try and make this simple house model here. Remember to go into edit mode, and remember the command for loop cut is Ctrl R. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'll move this one backwards, so GY5, and press enter, and Shift A to add, mesh, and then cube. So we've already got the base of our object. If I go into edit mode now, by selecting it in the drop down at the top left corner here, we need a loop cut coming down the middle, so down the middle here, and then we can select the top edge and move it upwards. So Ctrl R is the keyboard command for loop cut, and I can move that loop around the place, and I want it to be down here. So double left click. Remember, the first click is to choose the position, the second is to set it in place. Now I can select this top edge here. When I add a loop cut, it puts me in edge mode, so I'm already in edge mode, and I can press G, Z, and move this upwards. I can actually press 1, and it moves up 1 Blender unit, and the cube is 2 Blender units, so it kind of works as a roof. And then press enter. So that was a nice simple one to start off with. Now when creating the next object, it's important to remember this point, that we are in edit mode. So if I try and add a new object with Shift A, it's only giving me the mesh menu. Don't follow along with this bit, but if I add a plane now, and I just press G to grab to move it to the side so we can see it, because I added this in edit mode, it's actually part of this object. So if I go now back to object mode by coming up to here and pressing on object mode and press G to grab, they're joined together. So when you're adding objects, make sure you don't add them in edit mode. I'll go back to edit mode now, and if you press Shift A to add and only get the mesh menu, then you know you're still in edit mode, because it can only add a mesh to a mesh. Now you may not remember this, but don't worry too much. I'll just give you the command in case you accidentally do this. In edit mode, if we press P to separate and then by loose parts, now if I go back to object mode up the top here, I can now select both of them because they are two separate objects. But I'll delete the plane for now, and we will come across that command again later on in the course. So again, don't feel like you have to remember that. So I'm back in object mode, and I'm going to move this object in order to create a new one. So GY10 this time, and it can go behind the other one. So I've got two of my lovely houses. The second object I want you to try and create looks like this. So remember to go back to object mode, add a new cube, and make this object. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'll move this one out the way, GY15, Shift A to add, mesh, and then cube, into edit mode, so I can come up to here. The shortcut for that is to press tab on your keyboard, and I can tab into edit mode and press tab to go back into object mode. So press tab to go into edit mode, Ctrl R to do one of my loop cuts, around the middle here again, and I double left click last time, but remember you can press left click, which puts you into movement mode, and right click to cancel any movement and set it into place. So left click then right click will do the same thing as double left clicking quickly. Now I could select this top edge here, G, Z, then 1 to move that up, and then move the entire face upwards. That would work, but I'll undo that because I can actually select these two here, this one, and press G, Z, -1 to move them both down. And I've got what we call in the UK as a bungalow, so a house with only one floor. So hopefully you got an okay with that. Don't worry if you made it in a different way, but if it's drastically different, then do make sure you go through the method I've just done so it's the same shape as mine. Okay, so for the next one, I'll go back into object mode with tab. I'll move that backwards again, GY20 this time, so it's 5 Blender units behind the other one, and I'll show you the next one. Now I've moved this across to the side slightly. I can select that and press Alt-G to remove any grabbing or movement. Remember, if I press N on my keyboard and go to item, you've got the location here, and if I undo that movement, you can see it was located along the x-axis, and Alt-G is the same as removing that movement. So holding down Alt is often the undo of that command. So Alt-G, Alt-R, and Alt-S will remove any movement, rotation, or scale. So a little bit tougher this time. I want you to have a go at making this one. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'll move this across to the side. So I'll press GX -5 and just move it over to the side there, and press N on the keyboard to get rid of the side panel. Now I could press Shift A to add, but I could use one of these as a base from which to build the other parts. Try and quickly remember the command for duplicate. So that's Shift D to duplicate, and then I can press Y -5 and that will bring it forwards. So there's my duplication of the house. Of course, if I delete that, you could have just pressed Shift A, Mesh and then Cube, gone into edit mode with Tab and Control R to do a loop cut, double left click, select the top edge, GZ1 to create the same house. It doesn't matter which way you did it, but just remember the duplicate command is Shift D. So I can select these front faces here, and I'm going to press 3 on my keyboard to go to face mode. That's face mode up here. Select those two faces by holding down Shift and left clicking, and E to extrude to pull it outwards. And I could press 1 here, but it goes a little bit further than that, so 1.5, and it's roughly the same as the other one that I made. I wasn't precise with the other one, but 1.5 will work fine, and press Enter. So how do we do this extrusion out here? Well, I can select this face, E to extrude, and put it out this way, and maybe I'll extrude 1 and press Enter. It doesn't matter if you've got slightly different extrusion amounts, it won't make much difference, just as long as it looks nice. I'm just typing them in case you want it exactly the same as me. Now we can select this edge up the top here, so that's 2 to go to edge mode, so edge mode up here, select that top edge, and I can press G then Z to move that downwards. Now let's go to front view to make sure it's nicely in line. G then Z, and I know I've got that edge at the end there selected, and I can bring it down nicely around this point here. And that looks in a nice straight line. It can be tough to get that line exactly perfect, but going to front view and lining it up like this, you can see that that looks good. And because I've used whole numbers, we know it's on the corner there. But as long as it looks in a line, that's fine. It doesn't have to be precisely accurate. And in fact, a tiny bit of variation can be good because nothing's perfect in the real world. So we've got a house with a kind of extension on the side here. I'll go back into object mode, G then X -10 to move that over there. And now it's time for your last one, which is all the way over here. I'll press Alt G to remove that movement. And this is the shape you've got to try and create now. So pause the video and have a go at that. So I'll press G then X5 to move it across the side there. Again, we can duplicate one of these. So Shift D to duplicate. And if I press Enter now, the duplication is right on top of the other one, and I can press Alt G to remove any of the transforms, and it's back to the center. I'll just move this one a bit further out the way, so GY5 to just move that out there. Now if I come around to the side here, select my object and tab into edit mode. So that's pressing tab to go to edit mode here. Now this is a slightly tricky one. Because the roof doesn't actually meet up here, I can't go to face mode, select this face, E to extrude out. Don't follow along with this, but Control R to do a loop cut, and then select these two edges, G then Z to move them down. It just doesn't work because it's pulling this roof with it. So I'll undo that. So we need an extra face in here somehow. So we'll need to press Control R to do a loop cut around the middle there, and double left click. Now this you might find a little bit frustrating. The loop cut not following around evenly, because it's in the middle of this one and in the middle of this one, so it's going up following the shape. You can go to your tool options down the bottom left here as soon as you've done the loop cut. So if I click on this disclosure arrow here, I can press the even option, and that evens it out to that flat side. And if I turn that off, it will be in the middle. You've also got, if I turn on even again, you've got flipped, so it will be the same as the top there. But we want it even, so it's the same as the bottom. It's not actually important in this case because we're using the face on the other side, which is the same whichever way you do it. I'll minimize this for now. Come round to the side and go to face mode with 3. That's face mode up here. Select this face and E to extrude. And again, I'll press 1 so it's easy for you to follow along. Then press Enter. Now I need a way for getting this roof coming up here. So I can press Control R to do a loop cut all the way around my house. And then double left click. Select that edge there. G then Z. And I'll just move it up. Probably about 0.5. I'm looking at the top left of my screen, which is kind of over there. And you can see the amount there, so I can actually press 0.5 and it will go up 50 centimeters, which again you can see at the top left, and then press Enter. So that's how we made our fun little houses, and we can now make a kind of small village. So hopefully you got an okay with that. Make sure you've saved your work here, but as a quick challenge you might want to try making some different shaped houses in this really basic kind of Monopoly house way. But do make sure you've saved what you've got here already So you're all ready for the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to make a fun lighthouse. We're also going to learn about collections and the inset tool. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time. And I've got a few houses here. You might have a few different ones. And if you don't like what you've made, then you can just delete those. That's not a problem. But just make sure that you've got a few different houses for our landscape later on. Now it's important to note that I'm still in edit mode for this shape. So when I save my work, it saves in the mode that I was in, hence edit mode. So I need to press tab to go back into object mode. And you can see that I've got 4 different houses, but 2 of each. So we've got the bungalow, the normal house, and some of these funny extensions. And we can come over to the outliner and hide these like this by clicking on the eye. Remember that just hides them from the viewport, not the render when we render our scene. You can also click and drag along these to make them visible again. What would be useful though is to put these into a collection where I can press just one button, like this top collection here, to hide all of them at the same time. There's a couple of ways of creating new collections. We can right click in the outliner and press new collection there, but it's a bit easier to organize it within the viewport. So if I select all my objects by box selecting like this, unfortunately I've got the camera and the light in there as well. To get rid of those, I can hold down Control and box select. So that deselects certain objects, but keeps the other objects. And I'll just expand my outliner so you can see that I've got all those houses selected. Then with my mouse over the viewport, I can press M to move to new collection. And I can create a new collection. And I'll call this collection Houses and press OK. And you can see them all in that collection of houses there. That is actually how I prefer to name objects. Scenes can get quite dense and naming all these different objects can take a long time. I much prefer to just name collections. I find it a lot faster. To rename collections, we can double left click and rename this way. And that's the same for the objects as well. You can also click on an object and press F2 and that will go to the renaming options as well. You can even do that in the viewport. So if I select this house and press F2, I've got my object name there and I can press escape to cancel that. Now that they're all into a collection, I can actually press the I button here and that hides all the objects in my viewport and I can create my next object nice and easily. So I can now start creating my lighthouse without any distractions. So Shift A to add, mesh, and then cylinder. And remember, if you only see this mesh menu, you may be in edit mode for an object. So just check that you are in object mode when you're adding your objects. So Shift A to add, mesh, and then cylinder. So I'll zoom in on my cylinder, and if I press period key on the numpad to frame that object, you can also find that under the view menu, frame selected. You can see that it's got lots of faces around the cylinder, and the low poly style tends to have few faces. We can change that in here under the add cylinder options, and you can see the vertex count here under vertices. I'm going to change that down to 16. Now, how do you know what number to choose? Well, I always choose something that's divisible by 4, because quite often we use what's called a mirror, and we can mirror it both along the x-axis and the y-axis, so only working on a quarter like this. Hence why if I have 4 here, I can mirror it easily and only work on 1/4. But we'll talk about the mirror modifier later on. But for now, we've got our cylinder with 16 vertices. Now, as soon as I do anything to this cylinder, let's say I scale it very slightly, this disappears and changes to the resize option. I'll undo that scaling though, but you can see my dialog box doesn't come back. So as soon as you make any changes at all to this, you can't change its initial parameters, and you would actually have to add the cylinder once again. So let's make a lighthouse out of this. So I'll press tab to go into edit mode and select the top face. So 3 to go to face mode, left click on the top face, and I want a section to come out of this, but not right at the edge here. I want it kind of inset in here and then come upwards. In order to do that, there's a couple of ways. I'll show you with the tools that we've learned so far. So we press E to extrude, and straight away we press S to scale, and then I can scale it outwards. Looks a bit strange that does at the moment, but that becomes useful later. Or we can move the mouse inwards like this, and we've got ourselves a simple inset. I can then extrude this upwards, so E to extrude in the Z axis, and I've got this sort of ledge here now. So I've selected the top face, E to extrude, and then scale straight away to move it inwards, and then I can extrude that new face here. So pause the video and have a go at that. Extrude and then press S to scale straight away. Okay, so hopefully gotten okay with that. I'll move to front view now and let's have a look at my lighthouse. And we need to press G to grab, in the Z-axis to move this up to maybe somewhere like here perhaps, and I want to scale this down slightly. So we've got the startings of our lighthouse. It might have a bit of a big base as well, so I'll select this bottom face here, back to front view, G then Z, I move that up, just somewhere around there. And I'm not going to be too precise because it doesn't matter too much about the shape and size, and we can adjust it later on. So back up to the top, I want some sort of lighthouse top here. So I'll select the top face, I'm still in face mode up here, remember? I'll zoom in on that face. Remember you can press period key on your numpad to frame selected. And I'll press E to extrude and S to scale. This time I'll go outwards. So we've got that sort of strange flickering of the geometry. I'll left click to select there. And the reason it's flickering is it's called Z fighting. And that's because the face here has no depth. And therefore we've got this big face on top here, right on top of these tiny faces here. And Blender doesn't know which ones we want to see. But we solve that instantly when we press E to extrude and move it upwards. So we've extruded that face and moved it upwards, and we've got this ledge again. So take a moment to catch up with me, extrude the top face and scale it outwards this time, then set that into place by pressing Enter or left click, and then extrude it upwards in the Z axis once again. And you should end up with a ledge like this. So pause the video and have a go at that. Now I want to come up to the top here and bring this face in, so create an inset again, so there's a ledge there. Now remember I can press E to extrude, S to scale, and pull a face in like this. However, I'm going to undo that. There's another command called the inset command, and you can see that tool over here, inset faces, and if I hover over it you can see that the shortcut key is I. So if I press I, that does the extruding and scaling for me, so it insets the face, and I want to bring it in to about here. So instead of pressing E to extrude and S to scale, bringing my mouse in, I can just press I. And there's a few options here, which we'll talk about later. In fact, I'll close down my dialog box there, so it's not distracting. So pause the video here and have a go at the inset command with I. Now I want to give a quick challenge to you of creating the top of the lighthouse. So you can see the finished result here, and the very top point, we can just scale that top face to 0. So S to scale and then type in 0 and the face will become a point. Don't worry if it looks a bit complicated. You might want to save your work here though, so if it goes wrong you can easily reload and follow along with me. But pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I need to create the kind of light bit, so I can press E to extrude and bring that upwards. I might also want to go to front view just to see how big I'm making that. So I might G then Z to bring that up a little bit further. I'll press period key to zoom back in on that. And now I want to create one of those ledges again, so E to extrude and S to scale. And I can bring it out like this, then E to extrude upwards to around here, and E to extrude upwards again, and S to scale 0 to bring it into a point. And we've got a sort of lighthouse here. So hopefully you got an okay with that. Just pause the video here and check that that's the same as mine. Now if I'm not liking the look of the shape, I can start editing it fairly easily. So let's come into the top again, and I want this thickness to be similar to this one. I think this one's a bit narrow, so I can select the entire face loop coming around here by making sure I'm in face mode with 3, and Alt left clicking on one of the edges going across the face loop that I want to select. So I'll deselect that again with Alt A, that's to deselect all, and Alt left click on one of the edges going across the face loop that I want to select. Now I can come to front view and press G to grab in the Z axis and pull that down and make that a thicker ledge. And that looks a bit better. It's a bit wider here than it is at the top, so I can select this face loop. Again, Alt left click on one of the edges going across the face loop and S to scale, but you can see it's scaling in the Z axis as well as all the other axes. I'll undo that with Ctrl Z and I'll press S to scale, but Shift Z to scale in every axis except the Z. So Shift Z to remove the Z axis for scaling and bring those out to around about there. This will probably be easier in front view. So S to scale, Shift Z, bring that in so it's roughly in line with the ones below it. And we can see we've got a great fun lighthouse just there. So take a moment to make any adjustments to your lighthouse and then make sure you've saved your work ready for next time. So I'll start off by showing you what we're hoping to create in a few lectures' time. And in this particular lecture, we'll be learning about sculpting, and we'll be sculpting the rocky base of our landscape. So here's where we got up to last time. And do remember, I'm still in edit mode. So let's go to object mode for this object. And now I've got my lighthouse. I can rename this object. So I can press F2 and call this lighthouse. I don't put this one into a collection because it's its own object. And I've got my houses already as well. I'll probably make those a little bit smaller later on. So we've got the starting points for our scene. What I'll do though is I'll hide the lighthouse and the houses and put in the base, the water for our scene. For that, I'll press Shift A to add, mesh, and then plane, and scale it up nice and big. So that's around 30 times. If we look at the object properties here, you can see that I'm roughly 30, and I can easily change this later on. So just pause the video here and catch up with me. I've renamed my cylinder lighthouse, and I've hidden it, and I've added in a plane for the water, and scaled it up nice and big to around 30 times. Pause the video and catch up with me. Okay, so now we want to make a rocky base. And to do this, we're going to use a different modeling technique called sculpting. In order to sculpt, we need to have a starting object. So I'm going to press Shift A, mesh, and an icosphere is quite a good one. It doesn't really make a lot of difference what object you choose, but it must be a 3D object. So obviously a circle, plane, grid won't work. And an icosphere is generally a really good starting point. So I'll start with that. And there's my icosphere in the middle of my scene. I can rename that, so I'll press F2 and I call it Base Rocks. Now I can go into the sculpting workspace and you can see my mouse pointer has changed to what is now a sculpting brush. I've got all my different brush types down the side here. I've been put into sculpt mode and I've got new options up the top, which are the brush properties. You can also see those in the active tool and workspace settings over on the right hand side here, where you can also see my brush, the sculpt draw, which is this brush selected here on the left hand side, and lots of settings to go with that. The only one we'll use in this lecture is the radius, and that's just here. So with the draw brush selected, I can actually hold left click and paint on my icosphere. And you can see that's changed the shape slightly. If I want to resize the brush, I can press F. I'll move my mouse side to side. I can also change the radius over here, but it's much easier pressing F because you can see the size you're changing to. And I can make it really big and then make a sort of rocky base like this. Now you'll notice if I go around to the bottom that it's sticking through the floor. That's absolutely fine, and that's often the case that you'll have objects overlapping like this. So you don't have to worry too much about the underneath here, but you might want to kind of draw on the side here to maybe push that out a bit further. And we've got this interesting rocky base like this. So pause the video here and just have a quick play just with the draw brush. Try resizing your brush with F as well, and just get the idea of using that draw brush on your object. Okay, so now you've had a go at that. If I now keep painting on this, I keep stretching it out and maybe this bit here, and it's getting very, very sort of pointy. And the topology, the faces, edges and vertices, they're getting very stretched. So you could obviously go into edit mode and try extruding faces and things like that, but we don't need to do that in sculpt mode. So I'll press tab to go back to sculpt mode, and tab always takes you back to the previous mode. In our case, that was sculpt mode. So what I want to do is somehow add some topology. In sculpting, we add topology in a different way. There's two options. There's the Dyn Topo and there's the remesh. I think the most fun can be had with the Dyn Topo tool. So if you tick that, you'll get this warning message about vertex data. Just press OK, it's not important and it doesn't affect us. But with the Dyn Topo ticked, when I start sculpting now, can you see how it's changing our shape? And if I go to edit mode with tab, you can see how it's added all these extra faces to this side where I've been drawing, and only a few to the side over here where I didn't draw. So now if I go back into sculpt mode by pressing tab, I do always have to re-tick the Dyn Topo and press OK every time you come out of sculpt mode. But every time I draw, you can see it's creating this new geometry. So once again, back into edit mode, it hasn't stretched, it's just created more geometry. And back into sculpt mode, make sure the Dyn Topo is ticked again. So pause the video here and tick the Dyn Topo option and just do a bit more sculpting and try that out. Now there are lots of options within the Dyn Topo. If I click on the drop down here, you can see there's a detailed size, which is the size of the faces that it creates. You've also got a refining method and detailing. What I think is best for beginners is changing the relative detail, which actually changes the face size and the detail level, depending on how closely zoomed in you are to your object, that can get a bit confusing. It's much easier to keep with constant detail, which will keep the same size faces no matter how zoomed in you are. You'll notice though that the resolution changed and now it's at 3. Let's just quickly try that out, and you can see it's a little bit more blocky, but that's still absolutely fine. So a resolution of 3 is no problem. With constant detail, the higher the number, the smaller the faces. The previous one, relative detail, the lower the number, the smaller the faces, which can be a bit confusing. Again, just change to constant detail under the detailing, and a resolution of 3 should be fine. Now I can sculpt away and make some sort of rocky base, as you can see here, which is a bit funny looking. But before you make your base, I just want to show you another couple of things. First of all, you can dig into your mesh by holding down Control. So Control digs in like this. So it does the opposite of your brush. My brush to start with is kind of pushing out like this. Control digs in. Also, there's different types of brushes. So if I come over to the left-hand side where my brushes are and my cursor changes, I can click and drag and pull out the names of the brushes. And we're on the draw brush at the moment. The other brush I want to show you is the grab brush. This is really useful as well. If I click on that, I can grab the mesh and pull it around into different positions. And I can create a sort of weird rocky base like this. Now the thing about the grab brush, which makes it a little bit different from other brushes, is it doesn't work with the Dyn Topo. So when I pull the mesh around, you can see it's stretching there. So it's not creating any more faces. When I go back to the draw brush and start drawing, it suddenly turns into lots of those faces again. So the grab brush is great because it makes it very quick and easy to pull around your shape and make some sort of rocky base. But the draw brush is great because I can add some faces to my rocks. So I'll just zoom out a touch and create some sort of rocky base. I'll use the grab brush and pull it out over here. So we've got the sort of rocky area where the lighthouse is going to be, and maybe some sort of higher area over here where our houses are going to be. So just a little bit more of a slope, something around that. We'll make it look all blocky a little bit later on, but I'm just sort of making sure that it kind of sinks into the floor properly. Don't worry too much what's happening underneath, it's not important. But we're roughly around there now. I could go back to the draw brush and maybe press F to resize and dig this section in if I wanted to, and make this section a bit taller. Give it a flatter top like this maybe. I think also I'll just make an area for the lighthouse to sit on somewhere around here. So there's the town up here and the lighthouse over here. Roughly something like this anyway. So your challenge then is to make the rough shape for the rocky base. Again, we'll make it look all blocky and reduce the faces into this low poly style later on, but just get the rough outline of the base like I've done here. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the decimate modifier to change the poly count of our base rock. So here's where we got to last time, and we've got our blobby sort of sculpted rocky base here. And I'm still in sculpt mode and still in the sculpting workspace. And to reduce this down to that sort of low poly style, which has far less faces, which we want for our final landscape, I'm going to go back to layout mode, and I'll zoom in on my object with period key on my numpad. Remember that is in the view menu as well, under frame selected. And with that selected, I can go to the modifier panel here. So modifier properties, the spanner or wrench icon on the right hand side here, and add in a modifier. Now modifiers do what they say, they modify your shape, and the modifier we're going to use is a generate modifier, so it actually generates new geometry on our object. And I'm going to go down to the decimate modifier, and I'll click on that. Now nothing happens to our object yet, but what the decimate does with this ratio here, as I bring this down, you'll see the shape slowly changes, especially when I get to the very low numbers here, and it suddenly becomes an object with far less faces. So I've got a ratio of 0.01 roughly, and that looks a nice sort of chunky low poly look, similar to what we have in our final landscape. So this modifier is changing our object to have far less faces. It's actually a really useful modifier because if you have high poly objects, so objects with lots of faces, and you want to reduce them, you can sometimes use the decimate modifier. It even gives you a face count down the bottom here, and having a face count can be very useful if I want to export this to a game engine, because often you need to keep track of the amount of faces you're using. So pause the video here, select your rocky base that you've sculpted, and add the decimate modifier to it. Then try pulling down that ratio number until you get something similar to the face density of mine. Now at the moment, the modifier is on the object, so it's enabled, but it's not applied. If I come across this drop down here, there's an apply option. So it is doing something to the object, but we can apply it as well. What I mean by that, if I go into edit mode now, you can see my original mesh with all its triangles. And in fact, if I go up to the top here where it says the overlays, click that drop down and go to statistics, and it shows that I'm almost 14,000 faces and the decimate is bringing it down to 156. But you can see it's not actually applied. Only when I go to object mode can I see the results of this modifier. So I can come to the drop down here and click apply. Control A is the shortcut. But before I do that, I just want to show you that if I go into edit mode, so tab into edit mode, and try and apply here, I can't. And if I hover over, it says you're not allowed to do it in edit mode. So I'll go back to object mode, go to my drop down and click apply. Now my shape has actually had the modifier applied. If I go into edit mode now, you can see it's lost all those faces and we're left with our 156 faces here. So pause the video and catch up with me and apply your modifier. Now it's important to say that applying modifiers is what's known as a destructive workflow. So if I want to go back and maybe edit the shape in sculpt mode with all those triangles, I can't because I've applied the modifier. That's why a lot of the times you just keep your modifiers enabled and you don't apply them. Then you can go back into edit mode or into sculpt mode and change the original shape. It doesn't matter for us at the moment because we can easily modify this shape with what we've got here, and we could even go back into sculpt mode and do that. So this is absolutely fine. Now if I want to edit this, I can actually go back to the sculpting workspace, perhaps go to the grab brush, resize my brush and start pulling it around. I've not got Dyn Topo turned on. I can just modify this shape as it is in its low poly state and just move things into position as I see fit. I've not really made any changes here, but I might want to flatten out the top here perhaps to make sure my houses can fit on nice and easily. But generally speaking, the decimate modifier kind of keeps the shape quite well. The other way of modifying the shape is to go to layout view. I can go into edit mode again, and as we're used to, I can go to the vertices here and maybe G to grab and move them around. We've got a very long thin triangle there. I might want to maybe spread that out a bit so it's a bit more even. Doesn't make too much difference though, but I can easily modify it like that. I can also turn on the button called proportional editing just up the top here, and the keyboard shortcut for that is O. If I press that and press G to grab, it's got what I call a circle of influence, and I can use the wheel of my mouse to make that bigger, and then it acts a bit like sculpt mode, where I can move lots of vertices around. So I can select vertices, pull them around, and change my shape, a little bit like sculpt mode in some ways. So your challenge then is to have a quick go using sculpt mode, without Dyn Topo, using the grab brush just to move the mesh around very slightly. You don't have to make any major changes, just to see what that feels like. And also go into edit mode and use the proportional edit tool. Select a vertex and remember to use the wheel of your mouse to change that circle of influence and just see what that feels like. Again, you don't have to make any major changes. Just try these things out so you know how they work. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be learning about snapping and how we can snap our houses onto our rock. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time. And remember that we're in edit mode, so I'll go back to object mode here. And I'll just bring the outliner down so we can take a look at our objects. I can see that I haven't named the water yet. If I select that, it's still called plane. So I'll double click on that and change it to water. And let's bring our houses back and our lighthouse back to start positioning them on our rock. Let's start with the lighthouse. So I'll select that. I'll come to front view and G to grab, move that roughly into position somewhere around here. And I want to scale it down, I think, so it's about this sort of size. Now notice it scales around the object origin, this orangey yellow point here. That's very useful. If I press S to scale again, you can see it changing in height from the object origin at the base. So just bear that in mind for the moment, because we'll be needing to move object origins later on. Now I'll have a look and reposition it from the side here. So G, then Y, and I'll move it over to this sort of crest here, maybe down a touch, G then Z, just so it completely overlaps the base there. Okay, so pause the video here and place your lighthouse into a position where you want it. It doesn't have to be the same as mine. You might have a completely different shaped rock. Just put it somewhere where you think it works. Okay, so let's think about the houses. Now my houses are kind of stuck within objects, so I'll just hide the other things by clicking and dragging over the eyes for those, and we'll get rid of the camera and the light for the moment so they're not distracting. Now at the moment I've got 8 houses, so I've got 4 originals and then 4 duplicates. I'll just delete the duplicates for the moment because you may not have those. So I've got my 4 original houses here. So I'll bring back the base rock and the lighthouse so I can start moving them on top of the rock and start getting the size and think about the scale. Now it's difficult to see one of them, so to select them I can come up to my outliner here and select them, and maybe G then Z to move them upwards. Also we'll want to scale them down quite considerably because a lighthouse is quite big in comparison to a house, so I can press S to scale and scale them in. Now notice they all come into the center point of all the objects. So if I press S to scale, you can see that center point being roughly around this house, and they all drag in towards that. That's absolutely fine in this case, but it's something we can change if we need to. Now to position these houses, I'll select one and press G to grab and move it into position. And then I want to move it above the rocky base here, and that's great. But I'm going to want to create lots of these, and it's a little bit awkward. If I select the next one, go to top view, G to grab, try and move that into position, come around to the side here. It's not a big problem, but it's a little bit time consuming to do it that way. It would be much better if we had an option for sticking these to the rock. Well, we can use snapping for this. So up the top here, we've got this magnet, which is snapping. And if I tick that, the initial setting is increment, so it snaps to the grid. And I'll show you what that looks like. If I select this and press G to grab, you can see it sort of snapping to the grid like this. I'll undo that movement with right click though. And we've got lots of other options as well, but the one we want is faces. So if I select that, now my object, if I press G to grab, will snap to any faces, which is kind of working. So it's snapping to the faces of the lighthouse, to the faces of the rock here, but it's not quite right because sometimes it digs into the objects and sometimes it jolts its position and snaps to a corner. It's a bit unpredictable. So I'll right click to cancel that movement. If I go back up to the settings, we've got snap with, and at the moment it's on closest. So the closest point of my house to the object is the part that will snap. Basically it's a bit strange. If we change this to center and come back to my object and press G to grab, you can see that my object origin now is the part that's snapping to the face. Can you see the object origin there is aligned with this face? That's a lot better. So if I press G to grab, it's kind of sitting on top of the plane. However, let's move in. I need to move this object origin so it's a bit lower down because my house is obviously indented too far into the rock. A little bit of indentation is good, but this is a bit too much. Well, I'll show you how to change that in a moment, but first let's just bring our other ones over. So I'll select the next house, G to grab, and just bring that over, and the next one, G to grab, and bring that over as well. So they're all in a good starting position. So pause the video here, scale your houses down to a reasonable size, and bring them over to the top of the hill. Okay, so how do we change the object origin? Well, there's a couple of ways of doing this. We have got options. If I right click, there's set origin. We've got things like the 3D cursor, the origin to geometry, which will take it to the middle of the geometry, and so on. But they're not particularly helpful for us at the moment. We've also got an option, if I go up to the options here, to affect only the origins, and I can tick that and press G to grab in the Z axis to move that up and down. So my movement controls are now only affecting the origin, which is a nice easy way to do it, but it's not the best way at the moment. So I'll come up to options and turn off affect only origins. Now when I press G to grab, I'm moving my object again. And for now I'm going to turn snapping off because that may get confusing. What I can also do, if I come around to the front here, press period key to zoom in on my object, I can go into edit mode and select everything by tapping A on the keyboard. That's difficult to see, so let's go to wireframe so we can see that. There's my object origin in the center there. If I press G to grab in the Z axis, I can move it up, and I don't want it right at the bottom because I want it to overlap the base slightly. So probably somewhere around here is going to be quite good. So moving objects in edit mode will not move the object origin. If I press G to grab, you can see that object origin staying still. I'll right click to cancel that. But when I go to object mode and press G to grab, we are moving the object with the object origin. Let's go back to solid mode now, and I'll do the same for the other objects. but this time I'm going to select all three of them. I'll go into X-ray view this time, I think that's possibly a little bit easier, and come around to the front with one on my numpad. Now I can actually go into edit mode with all these objects, so press tab to go into edit mode, select all, and press G to grab in the Z axis and move up, and you can see their object origins there underneath the houses at the moment. I can just bring those down to somewhere like here. So in a sense, when we're in edit mode, we're not actually moving the object origin, we're moving the whole object away from the object origin. But I do find that fairly efficient for where you place your object origin. So I'll press tab to go back into object mode, and let's turn off X-ray mode. And lastly, I'll just show you once again that you can just select one and go to options and affect only the origins here, and press G to grab in the Z axis and move that up and down independently. But do remember you need to turn this off again, which is why I find working in edit mode a little bit faster. So pause the video here and move the object origin so it's just up a little bit from the base of your objects. Use both techniques in edit mode and affect only the origins just to get the idea of both. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so now I should be able to turn snapping back on and press G to grab, and now I'm snapping it and it's sinking in slightly to my object because the object origin isn't quite at the base, and that looks quite perfect to me. So I can move these around and they're all sitting on top of the hill really nicely. Now it's worth noting, just under the snapping, that we can have things like align rotation to target. If I tick that and then come to one of my objects, you can see that it aligns to the rotation of the face. That's called the normals of the face. And you can move these around so they stick on your island like this. Obviously that's not what we want, so I'll undo that and turn that off. Also underneath that we've got project individual elements. If I select many of them and press G to grab and move it over to here, let's say, it's taking the center point of all the objects and snapping in relation to that. So this one here is actually sticking above the ground. And when I press G to grab, it goes back in. However, if I turn on project individual elements and then select all of them, when I move them now, each individual house is now sticking to the floor. So the individual objects and their object centers are sticking on the base of the rock. So it's better to have that turned on if you select lots of objects at the same time. So pause the video here, turn the snapping back on, make sure it is snap with center, and you might want to try out project individual elements and snap your houses to the top of the rock. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be duplicating our houses and creating the village, and we'll be using linked duplicates. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and I want to start positioning my houses and duplicating them over the top of my rock here. Now I think my houses are a little bit big, so I'm going to select them all with box select like this, and I want to scale them down. But what if I wanted to not just scale them into the middle like this, but I wanted to scale each of them individually around their individual object origins? Well, to do that I can come up to this option here, which is the transform pivot point. So if I click on that drop down, the default is median point, so that's the middle of all your objects, but you've also got an option here of individual origins. So if I tick that and now press S to scale, they will actually scale by their individual origins. And that looks a much better size. Do remember though that that has been enabled for individual origins. You might want to turn this back to median point so it behaves as you'd expect from that point on. So just pause the video here and select all your houses and scale them by their individual origins. So now I want to copy some of these and scatter them around the top of my rock. So I'll select one of my objects and let's zoom in. And so far I've been showing you Shift D for duplication, and we can see our object snapping to our surface nicely there. And I'll left click to apply that. Just be aware that I still have snapping turned on. Now the duplication can also be found under the object menu here. So Shift D, duplicate objects, but we've also got duplicate linked. So if I press Alt D, that duplicates this object as a linked duplicate. So I'll just move around so you can see them both and go into edit mode for this object. And let's say I wanted to select this face here, so 3 to go to face mode, select that face, G to grab in the X axis and move that across here. Oh, and I've also got snapping turned on, so I'll just turn that off for a moment as well, G, then X, and move that across. Now you can see that it's affected both objects, so they are, as it says, linked. So any changes I make to this one or this one will be updated on both of them. I'll undo those changes and go back into object mode. This is really useful because if I know I want all these houses to definitely be the same, which you'd expect to have on something like a housing estate, and I've made lots of duplicates and I've placed them around my island, if I suddenly think, oh, the roof is a little bit short, and want to go in and change the roof height, I only need to do it for one of my linked duplicate objects. It also means that any textures I add to this will update on each of the links as well. So it's a big time saver. It can also reduce your render times and speed up viewport performance if you have lots of these objects in the scene. The only problem comes if I suddenly think, actually I want to change one of them and I don't want it to update on all of them, which we'll talk about in a second. So just quickly pause the video here and catch up with me, create a normal duplicate and then a linked duplicate with Alt-D. Pause the video and have a go at that. So currently these two objects are linked. What if I want this one to be linked to these two as well? Currently if I go into edit mode for this one, and let's say change this vertex here, it's not updating on the others. I'll undo that though. If I want to link an object, I select that object and I select the one I want to link it to last. So shift left click on this one, that becomes the active object. Remember I was talking about that in a previous lecture. So it's highlighted a more yellowy color and you can see that in the outliner as well. So now I can press Ctrl L, or I can go up to Object and down to Link/Transfer Data. That's the same menu. So Ctrl L, and I can link object data. You can see there's also link materials and copy modifiers there as well, but link object data will be the same as if I pressed Alt-D. So I press that. Now when I select this one, go into edit mode and select that vertex again, G to grab, you can see that they're all moving. So they're all linked. So pause the video here and link all three objects together. For me, these two were already linked, so I only needed to link this one to this one. Remember, the one you want to link to, that's the one you select last and it becomes the active object. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so what about if I wanted to separate one and wanted to make changes? Well, let's say this one is the one I want to separate. So I'll move around slightly. Again, we go up to the Object menu and we come down to Relations. There's Make Single User, and we again choose the object and data. Now this is its own object. I can go into edit mode, select that vertex and change it, and it doesn't update on the others. So I'll undo that and go back to object mode, and it's its own separate object. So pause the video here and unlink one of your duplicates. Okay, very quick challenge. I want you to link it back up. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that. I select the object that I want to link, and either of these two, because they're both linked together, I can select one of those and just check that that's the active object. It's highlighted yellow. Ctrl L to link, link object data. Now they are all the same. If I go into edit mode with this one, and again move that vertex, you can see they're happily joining in. So I'll right click to cancel that, go back to object mode, and what I want to do now is to copy lots of these, but I'm going to use the link duplicate function because it will be much easier if I want to make any changes, and they will all have the same materials, so I won't need to apply lots of different materials to different objects. So I press Alt-D to duplicate, and also I might rotate them around a little bit so there's a bit of randomization. So I'm rotating in the Z-axis. Probably easiest in top view, Alt-D and rotate. Alt-D, I can move this one right next to the other one here. Alt-D, rotate. And just every now and again, see how you're getting on. I think I need a few more, so back into top view again, duplicate with Alt-D and rotate it around. I can even join them up, so one could be an extension of another just by overlapping it slightly and rotating it into position. Just got to try and rotate it so it's in line. And all this time I've just realized I hadn't turned snapping on. So I can turn snapping on, select all my objects, and obviously deselect the rock, and just press G to grab, and they should all snap to the surface now, and that's worked nicely. These ones are a bit too much on the slope, so I can try rotating it around, but it is still too much, so I'll just move that back up the slope a bit, maybe into here. Same with this one. I think that's just about passable, and this one as well. I'll move it so it doesn't overhang too much. We don't have to be too precise with this. I think it looks okay. This one is actually now sticking above this roof. I can turn snapping off and press G then Z to move that down, so it becomes more like an extension. I could of course just delete it because we don't have to have extensions. So I'll speed this up very slightly. I'm just adding a few more, rotating them around, making sure they look how I want them. And remember, at any time, if I want to scale them all, I can select them all, deselect the base rock, and come up to individual origins and scale them down a touch. And I think I prefer them like that. Let's just quickly bring back the water and see what our village on top of the rock is looking like. And that's looking great. So a challenge to you is to duplicate your houses using the linked duplicate command and position them and move them around. Do remember to turn snapping on, it's much easier. And then once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll learn how we can texture different parts of an object using material slots. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and we're now ready for texturing, so let's jump across to the shading workspace. I'll just get to a position where I can see my scene nicely. So first of all, we'll work in material preview mode. So we've got our HDRI in the background already set up for us, and we're just adding colors to our objects. Now we don't really need these windows over the side here, and I'll quickly show you how you can adapt the workspaces and customize them. So if I want to get rid of this window here, I can get this window to overlap that one. I come up to the corner here where my cursor changes to crosshairs. So I'm still in this side here. I can click and drag over the other one and that gets rid of it. If I want to bring it back, then I can come up to the top where I've got my crosshairs again and click and drag and pull out a new window and of course change it back to the image editor. Now you can also go into the middle of the two where your cursor changes again to a double arrow and right click and join areas. Then it asks which way you want to go. I want to overlap this one, and I can get rid of it that way. I can also, if I come up to the top here, and where I get my crosshairs here, I can overlap this way and create a bigger window like this. And to get rid of that, come from this window over to this window and make a bigger shader editor. So I'll get rid of the file browser as well by making my 3D viewport bigger, clicking and dragging like this. Now it's worth noting that if you had lots of windows like this and it became a complete mess, you can always come up to the top here. If I middle click, I can scroll along to the end here and press this plus icon and I can create a new shading workspace and it gives me the default. I could then right click on the original and delete it. I can also reorder these if I want to. But for now I'll just delete the new one that I made. So right click, delete, and go back to the shading workspace and just quickly get rid of these. So pause the video here and modify your workspace so it looks similar to mine. So let's click on the base rock, create a new material. I'll call this rock, and let's change the base color so it's fairly dark and grey, something around here. We can obviously modify these a little bit later when we get our lights in, but for now that works nicely. So a brief challenge for you is to first give your rock a new material and make it a fairly grey color, then select the water and give it a very dark blue material and make it very reflective. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that. If I select my water, give it a new material, I'll call this water. Give it a sort of dark blue material somewhere around here for the value and over here for the color, and bring the roughness right down. Now I can't see any reflections. That's because I haven't set up Eevee with screen space reflections. Just have a quick think of where we can change those settings. So we come across to the render properties. In here, our render engine is currently Eevee, and I can turn on screen space reflections and we get that reflection in the water. We could also turn on ambient occlusion and maybe just turn up the distance a little bit so we've got a little bit of shadows where the objects meet, and that's looking a bit better. Okay, so what about the houses? In our final render they've got two different colors. So how can we set up one object with two materials on it? Well, I'll select a house, I'll zoom in on it with period key, just come around to the side here. First of all, I'll give the whole object a color, so new material, and I'll call this house yellow, so it's going to be slightly yellow, and change the base color so it has a slight yellowy tinge over here. It's sort of yellowy browny, I suppose, and maybe a tiny bit darker somewhere around there, as if it's sort of a plaster render. And notice how it's updating on my linked duplicates. So let's come back round to the side here. How do I give the roof a red texture? Well, we've got what are called material slots. We've currently got slot 1, and if I click on the drop down, we've got house yellow in slot 1. If I create a new slot, There's a new slot down here. I can then add a new material in here and put it on my roof. First, I need to actually create a new material to put in here. So with slot 2 enabled here, click on the new material, and this is going to be house red. You could just as easily call it roof. And I'll change the base color to a reddy color, maybe a tiny bit darker. Now we can't see any changes on our object. That's because we need to assign different faces to different materials in our slots. So if I go into edit mode and select the faces for the roof, so 3 to go to face mode and select these different faces. Just make sure I get those. Now I can come down to my material slots, choose the house red, and then press assign, and that will assign these faces to that slot. And it updates on our house and on the linked duplicate. So I'll come back out of edit mode and choose a different house and do the same process. So we need 2 slots, so I'll create 2 with the plus sign. It didn't have any original slot because I hadn't got a base material yet. I can click on slot 1 and then choose the house yellow, and then I can click on slot 2 and choose the house red. So it's got 2 material slots at the moment. The last thing for me to do is to assign the faces. So into edit mode, select those faces, come to the slots, choose the house red and assign. And there we have our roof that's red and all our linked duplicates are updated. So as a challenge to you, I want you to complete the texturing of the other houses with the same textures. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you got okay with that. I need to come back into object mode, select one of the other houses. I'll zoom in on that so you can see it easily. Go to my slots. I need 2 slots. In the first slot, I choose the house yellow. In the second slot, I choose the house red. So it's got my 2 slots there. I need to go into edit mode now, choose those faces, and then come to my slots, choose the house red and assign. And there we go, that's updated on those other houses. The last one, into object mode, choose that house. Now this one does actually have a material already. That's because this was built using the default cube at the start, which has a base material. That's absolutely fine. We just add a new slot. And then for slot 2, we can give it house red, and we can change that base material for slot 1. We can change it across to the house yellow. Then into edit mode, select our faces and give them the red roof. That's updated them all, and we've got a fun looking village like this. So hopefully you've gotten okay with that. Do make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be adding material slots to our lighthouse, and I'll be talking through emission materials. So here's where we got to last time, and I'm still in edit mode for this house here. So I'll jump back into object mode, zoom out a touch, and let's take a look at the lighthouse. So I'll select the lighthouse and I'll go into edit mode. And in order to give it the textures, we will need to cut the middle up to give it that stripy look. So I can press Ctrl R and do a loop cut. To create more loops, we use the wheel of our mouse. So I can have 3 or 4. I think 3 is probably best. You can have 4 if you like. It's entirely up to you. It does depend on the length of your lighthouse. So I've used the wheel of my mouse to create 2 extra loop cuts, and I can double left click to set those into position. Now I can create material slots for the different areas. I want a fairly sort of grey base, a red and white colour for the different parts of the lighthouse, and also an emission, so a texture that gives off light for the actual light part of the lighthouse. So I'll need 4 material slots. So I can come down to the slots, create 4 different ones. Let's start with slot 1 and create a new material. This can be the white texture, so we can leave it like that, and I'll call it white. Slot 2, this can be our red texture. So I'll create a new material and call it red, and change the base color to red. I'm making it nice and saturated, so all the way out to the edge of the circle. The next slot, slot 3, we can have the gray base. So again, new material, gray base, and a little bit lighter than the rock, probably somewhere around here, should work fine. Then lastly, the emission texture. So I click on the last one, click new, and the emission is down the bottom here. There's emission here for the color and the emission strength here. Now before I change these, I'll assign it so you can see what it's doing. Therefore I need to select the faces going around here. So to face mode and Alt left click on one of the edges going across the face loop to select all those faces. Then I can come in and click Assign. Nothing changes because it's a white material at the moment. I'm just going to call it Emission. So I'll scroll down to the bottom and change the emission color, bringing it right up and across to the yellow slightly. You can probably just about see it changing there. If I change the emission strength now, you can see it getting brighter and brighter to somewhere around here. Now remember, in Eevee, this doesn't actually give off any light, but we can fake it. If I come across the render properties here and down to bloom, you can see suddenly it looks a bit like a light. I can adapt the color a little bit later on, but I'll probably make it a little bit more yellowy, somewhere around there. Now I need to fill in the other areas. I'll show you a handy trick here. If I zoom in a bit and select the top edge loop here, so Alt left click on one of those edges going across the face loop to select that face loop, but I also want to select this edge loop and this edge loop. Now I can press Shift and Alt and left click to select the next edge loop and the next one after that, but I'll undo that because there's an easier way. I can press Ctrl and plus on my numpad to grow the selection. That option is up here as well, so select and then there's more or less, Control numpad plus. So any adjacent faces will be added to my selection. If I press Control minus, all the outside faces of this selection, so these ones here, are deselected. I'll do Control plus to bring those back again. And now I can go to my slots and give it a red color and assign. So I'll do that once more. If I press Alt left click to select this face loop and press Control plus, either side, so the top here will be selected and the bottom here will be selected. So any faces touching the edge of what I have selected will then be selected as well. And I can come down to the slots and assign it to the red again. Okay, so a quick challenge for you. Finish off texturing the lighthouse, assigning the different materials to the different faces. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully gotten okay with that. I can select this edge loop here and this edge loop here by Shift Alt clicking and come down to my slots and assign the red. And on the last one, Alt left click, Control plus to grow the selection. I can of course Shift Alt left click this small edge here as well if I wanted to. And let's change that to the grey base and assign. Let's zoom out a bit and see how we're getting on. I'll come into object mode, deselect all with Alt A, and it's looking really nice. I do think that this indent here isn't quite working, so I'm just going to select on the rocky base, into edit mode, choose that edge vertex there, and just bring that in slightly. Now snapping was turned on, so I have to watch out for that. Turn that off. I can just bring it across over here. Somewhere around there looks a bit better. Let's go back into object mode, and that's much nicer. I think I might do the same for this one as well. G to grab, bring that down, and I think that looks much nicer. You may not need to make any minor changes like that, because your base will look a little bit different from mine. So, as always, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we're going to add some lighting and create some atmosphere using the render settings and render our final image. So here's where we got up to last time. And we want to start thinking about lighting, so let's go across to rendered mode and see what we've got. Already it looks okay. We've got a very grey background, which is giving it a very grey feel all over. Because remember, the background colour influences the colour of the scene. So let's change the background colour. Try and quickly remember where we get to the world settings. So hopefully you remembered it's down the bottom corner here. So under object, we change that to world. Now you don't always see your nodes. If I press the home key now, that will frame all. It's the same as going up to view here and frame all, and then I'll be able to see all my nodes. We can come across to the color here and change it across to a blue, and already that looks a bit more like moonlight. And for our final scene, we want the lighthouse to be kind of operational, therefore we want it at night. And many people think you just make the background black and take away all the lights except the lighthouse. And whilst that may be true in real life, a lot of the time with your nighttime renders, in order to see things, we actually have quite strong blue coloured lighting, so we can see the whole scene, but it has that nighttime feel. Therefore, I'll keep the strength at 1 for now, and I'm going to place another light in the scene, acting as if it's the moon. The best light for that would be a sunlight, so Shift A to add, down to the light, and then under sun. Now that's put it where my 3D cursor is, and if I press G to grab, we can see it's pointing straight downwards like this. Lights tend to be much more atmospheric if they're coming from one side, so I can move this yellow dot up to the side here, or up to the side this way. I think I prefer it coming from the left, in fact. So the light is coming across this direction and lighting up this side of our objects. And that looks good, but we can change the parameters of our light. If I come across the light properties here, I can again change the color to a bluey color. And once again, I think that looks much more atmospheric. I could even up the strength to maybe something like 7. It seems a bit bright at the moment, but I will make some more changes in a moment. But first it's time for you to catch up with me. Change your background color to a bluey color and add in the sun pointing at the scene from one side, and change the color to a blue color and put up the strength to something like 7. Pause the video and have a go at that. So let's start making some adjustments. We could possibly go a little bit more saturated, so out to the outside of the circle. It depends what sort of scene you're looking for, but more sort of cartoony would come further out, and more subtle would probably come in a little bit further. So somewhere around there, I think I like the look of. We probably also want to change the direction of our sun. However, I want to be able to quickly come back to this viewport angle because I think it's really good for our final render. So really I want to move the camera so it's similar to this view. We can do that by holding Control, Alt and pressing 0 to go to camera view, and that moves the camera to our viewport. I can then press N on my keyboard, go to view, under view lock, lock camera to view, and make sure that's ticked, and just start positioning this to my liking. I like to have a little bit of space either side, it makes it look remote, and we can also see these reflections. I like that position, so I'll turn off lock camera to view. That way, if I accidentally move into perspective mode, it won't move my camera with me, and I can easily press 0 to go back to camera view. And I'll press N to get rid of this panel. So pause the video here and catch up with me, and move your camera to your view by holding down Control, Alt and pressing 0, and making any adjustments to that angle that you see fit. Now I want to make a few adjustments to the position of my sun and maybe add some lights in where my houses are. For that, I'm going to have to go to top view a few times and then back to camera view to see how it looks. What would be even better is if I had 2 windows. So I'll come to the top where my cursor changes to the crosshairs, click and drag to pull out a new window. I'll zoom in on this one a touch so I just see my camera, so around there. And for this one, I can then edit things, position things, and see the final result over here. What's even more helpful, if I use my middle mouse button to scroll along this toolbar at the top, I can turn off the overlays here and turn off the gizmo here as well. So it's left with a nice clean finished render. I can then use the other viewport to add objects and move around my scene more freely. So pause the video here and split your view into 2, making one ready for the final render by turning off things like the gizmos and the overlays. I can now in this viewport come around to the top and maybe rotate my light so it's pointing a little bit behind the houses. I think that's quite fun because we get a shadow of our lighthouse across here. Maybe even further round, then I get the shadow of the houses as well. And in fact, I really like that with the shadows of the houses there. I think that looks great. Now I'm finding it a bit too reflective from the rock. So a quick challenge for you is to try and change the material of the rock so it's not so shiny. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I select my rock, but I can't see my material here. That's because I need to go to the world drop down here and change it to object. Under object, if I zoom out a touch and scroll down a bit, we have the roughness. And if I put that up, we've got much less glare coming from our island. And I quite like the look of this. I might want to adjust my light even more, maybe make it an even lower angle, maybe rotate it around the Z-axis a little bit more so it comes around the side. That's entirely up to you. We could even put the strength up. Maybe I want to put it up to 10, change the color. I'll leave you to adapt those different things. And you can see how often you'll want to tinker these things as you change something like a material. Suddenly you'll need to change the lights and so forth. Anyway, let's come into the houses, and I want a few atmospheric lights in here, as if there's a few street lamps or something like that. So I'll shift right click to move the 3D cursor. That's where my light will be added. Shift A to add, and a good light for this will be the point light. So I'll add that in there, and immediately we can see the results of it in our render. I'll change that to a nice yellowy color, similar to the lighthouse. And I think 10 watts is going to be about right. And I'm going to press Alt D to duplicate it and move it around. I'll press G to grab in the Z axis to make sure it's above the ground here. And I'll go to top view. That'll be much easier because it won't dig into the ground if I create a new one. So Alt D again. And remember, Alt D is for linked duplicates. And I'm just adding a couple of lights to brighten up this area. The reason I used linked duplicates is now I can change the color if I want to, make it more yellowy like this, and change the power, and they will all change at the same time. So I can tinker around, maybe a little bit less yellow, maybe a little bit more power, probably around 15 watts, something like that anyway. And I think that scene's looking fantastic. So pause the video and catch up with me and add a few point lights into your scene around the houses. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, lastly then, it's down to rendering. Let's quickly check our render settings under the render properties. We've got our ambient occlusion on, and you might want to change the distance, see what effect that has. It's not making a great deal of difference here. The bloom, you might want to use the drop down here and change the intensity of the bloom. And you can see that lighthouse light becoming brighter, and it makes it look a little bit more foggy, which is quite fun. So I'll bring that intensity all the way up to 0.1. We could even have a little bit of bloom coming from these, and that's the threshold there. And the threshold is the amount of brightness it needs in order to add bloom to an object. So if I wanted some of these areas to have bloom as well, then I would need to bring this down a little bit. So click and drag to bring that down. It is adding a lot of bloom to my scene though, so it's probably worth sticking to 0.8, which was the original. You can change the color as well. We could give it a yellowy tint there. That tends to darken it a little bit, so we could turn the intensity up to something like 0.5. Oh, and that's quite fun. Might be a little bit too much, so maybe 0.3. I'm certainly liking the look of this. So all I need to do now is render, so we can come up to render here, render image, or F12 is the shortcut. And there's my scene there, which I think looks really fun. At this point, I might want to go in and make any slight adjustments. We can see if I zoom in a bit that the house sits just above the floor here and there, so I might want to bring this edge up just very slightly. And I could just adjust the colors a little bit and experiment very slightly to see what different results I could get. So your challenge then is to do just that. Render out the final image, take a look at the render and think whether you want to make any minor adjustments. And once you've done a final render, perhaps this would be a great time to share your progress with the community. And of course, do make sure you've saved your work. So well done, you completed the first section. Hopefully you enjoyed the process. The first few steps can be very tough. Hopefully you'll find the next steps get easier as you go through and the level of difficulty increases. As I've mentioned before, do make an effort to share your work with the community. Also tag me in the post, as I like to see how people are getting on. The same goes if you share your work on Instagram or Twitter or render out an animation. Again, tag me so I can see how it's going. My Instagram and other links are with this lecture so you can easily find me. Hopefully you're now comfortable with the basics of the program and interface. Now you may want to try and improve your current scene, but I would recommend coming back to it later after the next section where you'll have learnt a few more techniques. So let's jump to the next section now.